Okay, here's our video, Living Environment Regions 5. We're talking about glyconeogenesis. This is the 5th video in our series. And we talked about carbohydrates in the last video. So what glyconeogenesis means is using alternative fuel sources instead of carbohydrates, using non-carbohydrate fuel sources like proteins. So let's break down this word. We'll use blue, why not? Genesis means creation. Underline that. That means creation. Creation. And I'm sure you've heard that word before, creation. Neo means new. And so this is a new creation of glucose, a new way of creating glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. We'll also talk about ketogenesis also in this video. All right, so here's our fresh baked bread. You can smell it if we had smell-o-vision, right? So our body prefers carbs. Our body wants carbs to get glucose, right? So we can just say it really wants glucose, and it prefers getting glucose from carbohydrates. But if it can't get it from carbohydrates, that's when we're going to talk about glyconeogenesis and ketogenesis. So just to review glucose, get our pen handy there. We'll put glucose up here. Glucose. We know that glucose is a simple sugar. From the last video, we talked about a simple sugar, and it is a monosaccharide. So mono means one, right? Let's write that over here, monosaccharide. And let's write the formula, the chemical formula. It has carbon, it has 6 carbon, it has 12 hydrogen, and it has 6 oxygen. So that's glucose, and the body wants that glucose because eventually it wants to create ATP, which is our energy currency, right? That's what the cells want. That's how the cells get their energy. And if we just keep saying it, I'll write it over here, adenosine triphosphate. Let's write it over here, adenosine triphosphate. And you'll just hear it as ATP. You may occasionally hear adenosine triphosphate. You say it enough, though, it'll just roll off your tongue. So when you eat this bread, this delicious bread that has been a staple for humanity for thousands of years, you can even argue that bread could be the cause of civilization itself. We use that in our terminology. We use it for money, bread and dough. I'm short on dough and so forth like that. But when you eat this and the glucose enters our bloodstream, as we talked about in the last video, the pancreas will release insulin, which will then cause the glucose to enter the cells. And let's look at a picture of that. All right, and here's a picture of the glucose building up in the bloodstream. And of course, we want this ATP, this energy currency, at the end. And then here's a picture I even had in the last video. Obviously, insulin isn't a key, right? But in a sense, the insulin is the key to have these glucose channels, right? These GLUT4 transporters to. Here's a better picture. Here's the GLUT4 transporters, and once the insulin binds itself, as you can see over here, it will move through into the cell membrane, and glucose will enter the cell. Very simple. You can look at last video 4 if you want to go into more on that. But now what happens though if there's too much sugar, right? The cells said, okay, that's enough. We don't need any more. What happens then? Well, the body is ingenious, right? The body will store the glucose as a glycogen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And it's going to be stored in the liver. So if there's excess sugar, excess glucose, it'll be stored in the liver and in the muscles, primarily the liver, as glycogen. Now let's just go over glycolysis. And this whole thing actually is cellular respiration. So let's look at glycolysis. Just review it before we go into glyconeogenesis. Basically, the process of glycolysis is to take glucose and to make ATP. That is the basics of glycolysis. So there are some stages, and we'll do some. Get the pen back up. Stick with blue. So in glycolysis is the breakdown, right? The breakdown of glucose. And there's many parts to this. Just doing it very simple. Then you have the Krebs cycle. It's also called the citric acid cycle. I forgot the C there. Put the citric acid cycle. And in this cycle, the glucose, very simplified right now, the glucose will be oxidated. And then from that cycle, here's our arrow, we'll just continue it over there, why not? We get into the electron transport, some people say transfer, but the electron transport chain. And this is the final result where we have ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That is a simple version of glycolysis. And again, it's all in cellular respiration. So like I said earlier, what if the cells have enough? They said, all right, this is enough glucose. We had enough. They're going to store it in the liver as glycogen. And the glycogen will stay in your liver about 10 to 20 hours. So when we're going through, let's say in our primeval past, we went through a lot of periods probably of fasting or starvation, then they will use up the glycogen, where the liver will turn the glycogen back to glucose. So that's ingenious, right? And that the whole process of storing it, and I'll have put on another vocabulary word. Use red, why not? So I'll write it over here. It's glycogenesis, not glyconeogenesis. Glycogenesis is where we store the glucose stored in the liver, the glucose to glycogen. That's glycogenesis. Now we're up to glyconeogenesis. That's when, let's say you ran out of your glycogen supplies, the body will use alternative sources. The body will try to make glucose in other ways. And this starts in the liver too. So this starts in the liver. It also starts, and we'll have the liver and kidneys, we should say, but 90% takes part in the liver. So let's look at that. And for glyconeogenesis, I'll just say GNG, and that's what you might see in textbooks, or you might have your high school teacher talk about that, GNG. All right, so when we're talking about GNG, what a word that comes up is pyruvates, and pyruvates are involved in glycolysis, and they're also involved in GNG, glyconeogenesis. So in glycolysis, get our pen going again. Let's change the color. I'll use that color. So in glycolysis, right, you have one molecule of glucose. Let's get that C in there. Let's get that back. Okay, let's try this again. So in glycolysis, right, you have one molecule, there's the C, of glucose, and it's going to yield eventually in this whole process 2 molecules of pyruvate. And again, very simple terms, pyruvate will enter the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. It will oxidize and yield 32 ATP molecules. So let's look at it like this. So the pyruvate will enter the Krebs cycle, and it will oxidize, because that's the oxidation cycle. And the result will be 32 ATP molecules. So you can see how important pyruvates are in glycolysis. Now, in glyconeogenesis, the whole process what pyruvates will do is, again, from non-carbohydrate sources, pyruvates will yield glucose. So when we're talking about, and we'll just change the color to green, when we're talking about glyconeogenesis, the pyruvates, fix that U there, we'll get glucose. So it's the reversal of what's happening in glycolysis. And so there is the glucose that we need, that the body wants. Remember, the body wants glucose, and it prefers It's easier if you have carbohydrates, but if you didn't have carbohydrates, we know by glyconeogenesis we can get glucose through pyruvates in many steps. Now, there is another one we talked about, I said we're going to talk about, is ketogenesis. So let's end this with ketogenesis. All right, so when we talked about glycolysis, the end result, and glyconeogenesis, the end result is to make glucose. But now, with ketogenesis, the end result is to make ketones for fuel. All right, and we'll say ketone bodies. So ketone bodies. So instead of glucose that the body will crave, it'll have ketone bodies for fuel. Some people say ketone bodies are more efficient, but that's debatable. So what the body will do in ketogenesis is they'll take stored fat or amino acids. Shouldn't put a parentheses there, but because we're not saying stored fat is amino acids. Amino acids are proteins. So and or amino acids, and they will convert that to ketones, be converted to ketones, and that'll be the energy source. So again, just to review, in glycolysis, we're going to get glucose from carbohydrates. If we have non-carbohydrate sources, we're going to use glyconeogenesis to make glucose with pyruvates. And with ketogenesis, we're not using carbohydrates at all, and we're not trying to make glucose, we're trying to make ketones. So you might see people who are on this all-protein diet or completely eliminated carbs from their system, and they might be in what they call a state of ketosis. So whether that is good or bad is not this video, but there has been a lot of debate on whether it is good for you or not. Anyway, in the next video, we'll talk more about proteins. Great job.